Hello everybody. Today we are going to begin a series on college lecturer exam, and it will also be useful for NTA net. We are going to begin with criticism, and in criticism as well we are going to take Plato today, and we can very easily say that with Plato we move into a different register of criticism. For the first time, poetry is the subject of a kind of philosophical critique, which raises fundamental and enduring questions about the nature of literature, and it's a justification as well. So the most important thing that you need to know that Plato never wrote any treatise or specifically written for poetry. Yet in all his works he has spoken enough about the nature of poetry and the kind of poetry, the effect of poetry on society, and some other important things that we are going to discuss in this video lecture. So let's jump to the first slide. So we are going to have a little introduction as well to all the critics, although to some of you it might seem that why are we going to study the introduction to the critics. It is not going to be asked in the exam. Yet I'll say knowing a little about a critic helps us in understanding that particular critic in a better way. So here we go. So as I've already told you that Greek philosopher, I'm calling Plato a philosopher and not a literary critic, because basically he was a philosopher, and his primary concern was not to talk about literature. Okay, so but we can say that Plato laid the foundations of Western philosophy, and there is a critic named A.N. Whitehead who says that Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, who indeed gave initial formulation to the most fundamental questions. And what were those questions? How can we define goodness and virtue? And see, some of the points might not seem directly connected to literary theory or literary criticism, but please bear with me because these points are directly or indirectly related with what we are studying, that is literary criticism. How do we arrive at truth and knowledge? What is the connection between soul and body? What is the ideal political state? Of what use are literature and the arts? What is the nature of language? So these were the primary questions that Plato concerned himself with, and although the answers to these questions, or we can say that the answers given by Plato to these questions might not seem appropriate in modern era, yet the questions themselves are valid and are of exponential value. So as far as our study is concerned, we will primarily be concerned with the last two questions of what use are literature and arts, and what is the nature of language. Okay, so at the age of 20, this is very basic information that you might read for yourself as well. He in the age of 20 he came into the influence of Socrates, and it was not unlike, okay, it was just like all other young men of the age. And Socrates, who was called the wisest man alive by oracle, and Socrates devoted his whole life to the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom and virtue. And what was his method of teaching people? His method was dialectical. Okay, and this involved questions and answers. And I would like to add a very small but important detail here, that Socrates would always showed himself to be ignorant, and when he asked people questions, showing himself to be ignorant, the true nature of people, came very clearly in front of him, and this was the reason he, made quite a few enemies of himself or for himself, and Plato was very much influenced by this method. So keep this method in mind, dialectical method, because Plato is also going to use this method in the form of dialogues. Now, as we have read many a times, Plato was condemned to death in 399 before Christ, and after the death of Socrates, Plato founded an academy in Athens, and most of Plato's philosophy is, expounded in dialogue forms. And as I have already told you, that he used the dialectical method, okay, in the form of question and answers. And the word dialectic derives from the Greek dialogemai, which means to converse. And remember one more thing, that in most of the work of Plato, the work is of Plato, but the main speaker is Socrates. Okay, remember, the main speaker in the works of Plato is Socrates. Although it seems very easy, but it is important in terms of exams. And when I say in terms of exam, I'm talking about RPSC, assistant professor. Now, Plato's work includes around 35 dialogues and 13 letters. And as I've already told you, that most of his work tries to explore concepts such as virtue, temperance, courage, piety, and justice. Okay, and the major dialogues of Plato are Gorgias, Apology, Phaedo, Symposium, Republic. Okay, and almost all of these works deal with the actually epistemology. Epistemology means theory of knowledge, metaphysics, political theory, art, and we can say that he talks about these four primary concerns in his works. Remember the names: Gorgias, Apology, Phaedo, Symposium, Republic, and most of us have heard the name of Republic at least. Okay, so now we move to his theory or his criticism, and when we start studying Plato, we must keep in mind the most important thing, or the most important theory propounded by Plato. The theory is the theory of forms. Okay, now I would like to explain it in a little easier language. We have this language in front of us, but I would like to explain it a little more. Now, according to Plato, the real world, which is actually perceived by us or seen by us, is not actually real world. Okay, I would like to give you an example. Anything physical that we see in front of us with the help of our own eyes is not actually real, or we can say original, because he believes that the only original thing is the idea, and it is the idea that makes the things. So idea comes first and things come secondary or second. So if somebody is going to make a table, first of all he must have the idea of a table in his mind. So the idea, as propounded by Plato, is original, and the table or the physical object is actually the copy of that original idea. So Plato thinks that this physical world is actually a copy of a higher idea. That higher idea might be of a god or any natural power that resides in higher realms or anywhere, but there is some power or some higher authority above us which had this idea of the world, and then this world was created. So you have to keep I would like to make the things easier for you. So remember, ideas are original and the things that follow them are actually a copy of those ideas. Okay, so I would like to read a few extracts from here, like Plato's renowned theory of forms, which sees the familiar world of objects which surrounds us and which we perceive through our senses as not independent or real, but as dependent upon another world. The another world that I talked about, the realm of pure forms or ideas, which can be known only by reason and not by our bodily sense perceptions, because ideas cannot be touched. So they can only be understood by reason or logic. Okay, Plato says that the qualities of any object in the physical world are derived from the ideal forms. Okay, so ideal forms are actually ideas. Okay, so ideas are primary and the physical world is secondary. Now you must be thinking why this man is repetitively saying ideas are original form and the physical world is secondary. What it has to do with poetry or criticism? So you'll very soon see that it is very important to understand Plato's theory of forms if we want to understand Plato's theory of criticism or Plato's rules involving criticism. So we move ahead. Now Plato gives us some examples, as I gave you the example of a table. He says that any triangle or square that we construct using physical instruments is bound to be imperfect. Okay, why? Because at most it can merely approximate the ideal triangle, which is perfect and which is perceived not by the senses but by reason. The ideal triangle is not a physical object but a concept, an idea, a form. Now this is why people sometimes call philosophy a difficult field to study. Now Plato says that any object, he is taking the example of geometry. Here I took the example of a table, which is not taken by me actually, which was the original idea of Plato. So he says that any triangle or any square that we make is first made in our mind. Okay, and then we only approximately draw that idea on paper or some figure. Okay, so what does he mean when he says we only approximate that? Because the ideas have this ability that they cannot be drawn into physical shapes as exactly as they arouse or arise in our mind. So the only thing that we need to understand in the last 3 or 4 slides, that ideas are original and the physical objects are copies. Okay, now according to Plato, the world of forms is the only reality available to us. Okay, because it is the world of essence, unity and universality. Okay, but the physical world is always full of perpetual change and decay. Everything that comes into this physical world has to die, but the ideas, as opposed to the physical things, never die. So we move ahead. Now in the seventh book of Republic, Plato gives us the myth of cave. Okay, he says the people who live in caves, they have spent all their life watching shadows of reality, okay, which are cast by the sun, but they are never able to see the real fire, the real sun. Okay. Now Plato says if one has to perceive the reality, one has to come out of that cave. Okay, so coming out of that cave actually means understanding the higher reality or higher authority, or you can say coming, as far as Plato is concerned, to coming in the fields of philosophy to understand the world of forms actually. And sorry, there was a disturbance. I forgot to put my phone on silent mode. Cave represents the physical world, and understanding the sun represents understanding the higher reality or understanding the world of forms or ideas. Okay, we can synonymously put these two terms, forms and ideas. So now we move to Plato's views on poetry. The Aeon, Plato's most systematic comments on poetry, occur in two texts, okay, separated by several years. The first one is Aeon, where Socrates close examines a rhapsode. Rhapsode is a singer or an interpreter, called Aeon. Name जो है उसका Aeon है. So the person named Aeon is actually talking to Socrates on the nature of his art. Okay, and the second version of, or the second part of this book is more succinct, where a commentary occurs in the Republic. In the Aeon, Socrates points out that the rhapsode, like the poet himself, is in a state of divine possession and speaks not with his own voice, which is merely a medium through which a god speaks. Now we are going to have a look for the first time in this lecture what Plato says about poetry. Plato says that when a poet writes something, he is not himself actually. He is, a kind of he is in a kind of state of a frenzy actually, divine frenzy we can say, to put it more concisely. So he is in a kind of divine frenzy where he is not in his senses, and through him actually any or a god speaks. So according to Plato, when a poet writes something, he is not actually in his own control, and it is the gods that make a poet write something on a page. Okay, so before we move ahead, you can very easily guess actually what kind of a value Plato is going to give to a poet who is not using his senses, and who is not even in his senses, and who is actually inspired by a heavenly inspiration. This heavenly inspiration makes him write anything. Okay, a poet can become anyone. Later he will call the poet that a poet can become anyone, any man. Okay, now moving ahead, Plato says that this inspiration is given by the goddess, which is called who is called Muse, to this poet, and this poet in turn inspires the rhapsode. Rhapsode is a kind of singer or interpreter. To make it easy, you can say that he is a performer who performs on a work written by a poet or a dramatist. Okay, so now what happens next? He compares this process to a magnet. And let me tell you one thing, because most of you will be watching this as well. It is written here that Socrates likens this, and I am saying Plato likens this. But you must remember that this work is written by Plato, and Socrates is a speaker. Okay, so don't think that Socrates is saying these things. Plato is making Socrates say these things. Okay, so he compares this whole process with a magnet. Okay, which in which case here, magnet will be the Muse, and when a magnet touches a ring or an iron ring, the iron ring also becomes magnetic and it can attract other rings as well. Okay, so now what happens here? Muse, which is magnet, inspires the poet, which is the first ring, and then the first ring becomes magnetic and it inspires or attracts the second ring, which is the rhapsode, which is an actor or an interpreter. Okay, and this second ring attracts the third ring or other rings, which are the spectators or viewers. Okay, so in total we can say that people, whether they are spectators, whether they are rhapsodes, or whether they are the poets, are equally inspired by the goddess Muse. Okay, now see, the last line of this slide is very important. I'll read it for you. In this way the poet conveys and interprets the utterances of the gods. Okay, the first one is the poet who conveys or writes the utterances of gods, and the rhapsode interprets the poets, and then the actors interpret the poets. So we can say the rhapsodes are the interpreters of interpreters. Okay, we can also call this process as meta interpretation. Okay, interpretation of a interpretation. So what does it mean? If we try to say or put it in easy words, how would we say it? We can say that when the poet writes something, he is inspired by gods. So when he writes something, he writes an idea into words. As I've already told you that ideas or forms are original. Okay, so when a poet copies that original idea into his work, the work will be a copy. Okay, like other physical objects. And when a rhapsode or an interpreter or an actor conveys the ideas or the words written on the page before an audience, he is actually copying a copy. Okay, so literature is actually twice removed from the reality. Okay, literature according to Plato is twice removed from the reality, and anything that is twice removed from the reality must not be good according to Plato. Now moving ahead, this slide is this slide needs not much explaining, so I'll try to read the words, whichever words are important here. So poet according to Socrates, which actually is according to Plato. Remember these words, these can be asked in the exam. A light and winged thing, and holy and never able to compose until he has become inspired. Means a poet never uses his reason. He can only compose when he is inspired, and is beside himself, and when he is able to compose, he is never in his senses, and reason is no longer in him, and there is no logic when he writes something. And he goes on one step further, and he says that not only literature but also criticism is twice removed from the reality. Okay, so here while he says these words, he is actually trying to separate philosophy and criticism or poetry. Take whatever you want. The poetry is basically divorced from reason. There is no reason in it. Okay, and reason is the realm of philosophy. Okay, poetry in its very nature is steeped in emotional transport and lack of self-possession. Means there is no self control. Okay, and there is an emotional transport in poetry. We are going to read this transportation or study this transportation in Longinus, where he is going to consider this transportation positive, but Plato considers it to be a negative one. Okay, so this is our first video So I'm going to make it a little shorter. 25 minutes is enough, and let me know what changes can be made to this teaching style, because I cannot just give it in the form of a lecture. I need to be a little in the form of little conversation, although this is not a live class, but I'll talk like just like it. So that will be all. We'll be seeing each other very soon in the next lecture. Till then, have a nice day.